In every series, change is almost an absolute necessity. If the subsequent entry ends up feeling too similar to its predecessor, then that title feels like a wasted effort. At the same time, an installment can change so drastically that it ends up alienating the base of the original. Such was the case with Jak 2. Going from an innocent collectathon platformer to a grittier and darker sandbox game wasn't something that most gamers found to be the most natural transition. A lot of this had to do with the changing demographics at the time, with most of the attention going to more mature titles like GTA 3, but the cost was that Jak and Daxter as a franchise was pretty much left without much of an identity considering it lacked consistency. But the change that Kingdom Hearts went through under Birth by Sleep is a different story. You see, when Kingdom Hearts 2 first released, it was met with a lot of criticism regarding how easy the gameplay was. Some people said that despite the fact that there were a lot of ways to take out your foes, the fact that the combat never presented a challenge mitigated the gameplay to being a mash X to win simulator. Therefore, the Osaka branch of Square Enix thought that the best way to do this was to start from scratch. They decided to completely revamp the combat, despite the fact that it would have been easier to just build off of what KH2 presented. Not only was the gameplay transformed, but Birth by Sleep really retconned quite a few plot points in the story. Somebody might argue that Birth by Sleep is a prequel, so of course it's going to start over. However, the way they went about this did more damage than good. And the funny thing is, there are certain aspects that didn't need to be changed. They didn't need to change the way Keyblades work, but they did, and it brought with it a whole host of plot holes and retcons. They didn't have to go back to the drawing board with the battle system, but they did, and it brought with it a lot of awkwardly done mechanics that impeded with the fun of the experience. Seriously, it took an HD re-release as well as the addition of critical mode for people to realize the reverse was true. When the West finally got their hands on the final mix version and experienced the harder difficulty, more people found the need to utilize drives, limits, and the like. On the other hand, people realized that Birth by Sleep was unfair and very much unpolished in its execution. The love that it once received in the 2010s had all but dissolved once people started to examine it more carefully. But of course, if we were to begin this review, we must ask the fundamental question: does Birth by Sleep serve its part as a proper prequel to the first Kingdom Hearts? Well, I'm disappointed to say that it doesn't. I will give it this, that it does at least go into more details regarding how Riku was initially supposed to be the Keyblade wielder and not Sora. However, it fails on almost every other aspect. A lot of this has to do with the world building. So it's established that in this game that there are multiple Keyblade wielders, and they sort of have their own organization. Already, I'm sure you can tell that this goes against everything that was established in the first game, in which the Keyblade actually chose somebody to be its wielder. Now, of course, in KH2 it gets really finicky in the sense that Riku gets a Keyblade and Kairi as well, but Birth by Sleep takes all this to a new level by introducing a special organization surrounding the Keyblade Masters, almost in a way kind of like the Jedi Council from Star Wars. Not only was this never hinted at before, it gives the impression that Nomura arguably was making all this up as he went along, but it's not explained how this organization works. The way Ventus refers to the exam that Terra and Aqua are about to partake in almost makes it seem as if he's assuming that you, the player, knew what he's talking about, but quite the contrary. In KH1, the Keyblade is treated like a sentient object that chooses who they feel is fit. It was basically something that one needed to earn through strength of character in order to fight the Heartless. The fact Birth by Sleep gives almost the entire cast a Keyblade waters down a lot of its significance. And even with the scene where Terra performs the rite of passage to Riku, it's not explained as to how this works. Did Terra, Aqua, and Ventus have to go through something similar? Did Ericus himself bestow this upon them? As a matter of fact, Ericus never tasks Aqua and Terra with finding successors. There is one scene where Terra himself recites the rite of passage, and it seems to imply that it makes someone a Keyblade Master. It's true that there are certain things that can't be explicitly explained. However, with details like this, it really shows how underdeveloped the world Birth by Sleep was trying to depict. It's worse that this type of setting was nowhere to be seen or heard from in the other Kingdom Hearts games, and they never took the time to explain how it works. Now you might be thinking that there were a lot of unexplained aspects in Kingdom Hearts 1. For instance, it was never told to us how Sora and Riku ended up on Destiny Islands in the first place. The thing with those details is that they are very minute and don't really affect the story significantly. The same could be said about the origins of Terra, Ventus, and Aqua. However, the new lore this game introduces needs to be expounded upon. KH1 actually took the time to provide exposition on how its systems work, and Birth by Sleep suddenly changes everything. Now, it's true that the Xehanort reports do give some answers to this. For instance, while we never get to understand the function of Keyblade armor, the reports detail about how they're used to travel through the corridors of darkness, not too dissimilar from the black cloaks of Organization 13. But if you have to learn something by looking up the Xehanort reports, then that honestly shows the laziness of Nomura. We don't get to see for ourselves how these aspects operate. We've got to read about it like this was an afterthought in his mind. Showing versus telling is the most basic element in writing good stories, and Nomura just can't do it. This causes there to be a lot of disparity between what happens in-game and the reports. And to go further into the whole concept of lore, we don't get to see Squall, Yuffie, or Sid in their younger selves. Yeah, remember how important they were to the plot of KH1? Nomura clearly forgot they were even a thing. Instead, we have to worry about Ienzo and Evan and all the somebodies of these Organization 13 members. I mean, they're a part of the Kingdom Hearts universe, but it's really disappointing that Nomura forgot he was writing a crossover between Disney and Final Fantasy. The only Final Fantasy character that makes an appearance in this game is Zack. Yeah, I guess it's true that Nomura stated in one interview that he felt like the original characters should be enough to carry the story out on its own, but let's not forget that Leon and the gang were so integral in KH1 and 2. What the game chooses to talk about instead is show how Kairi got a Keyblade, or explain why Braga lost his eye and wears an eye patch. These kind of feel unimportant. I mean, how cool would it have been to see how Radiant Garden fell, and see Leon be referred to as Squall? It demonstrates how Nomura has forgotten the roots of Kingdom Hearts, and further exemplifies why Birth by Sleep fails as a prequel. But of course, the characters themselves don't really help in mitigating these issues. Of course, I'm sure most are familiar with the usual complaint that Terra, Aqua, and Ventus don't really feel like friends, and are at best acquaintances. The intro does sort of show them in a mutual bond, but there are some problems. First of all, I hate how they copy the intro of KH1, almost as if to say, hey, doesn't this remind you of these characters? Second of all, the dialogue among them feels somewhat stilted. Part of this has to do with how they all kind of fall into this one-note stereotype instead of feeling like actual people. From the onset, Ventus is the cheery younger son, Aqua the nagging big sister, and Terra the headstrong older brother that looks out for his younger sibling. Just watch this scene from the intro and tell me you don't see these stereotypes.
You two focus on the exam.
But Ven, you're in danger here. Go wait in your room.
No way. I've been looking forward to this. Seeing you two become masters. I'm not gonna miss it now.
He can take care of himself. He's been out there training just as hard as us.
Yeah.
So they end up feeling unnatural in their characterization, unlike another trio of characters they're based off of. But if we were to dissect each of them individually, there's some good and bad qualities to each of them, even if their friendship isn't believable. Ventus is probably the worst. Basically, the background with him is that he's a person with no darkness inside of him, being pure of heart. However, he has a bit of a traumatic past in the sense Xehanort stripped his darkness away in order to make Vanitas. In a way, he kind of reminds me how some people act all cheery and energetic to mask some form of depression. The main issue I have with this development is that it's all stuffed all the way towards the end of the game. Vanitas kind of hints at it throughout the story, but it's all dumped on top of you in the third act, which prevents it from having good build-up. Another thing I dislike about him is that because Ventus is very cheery all the time, sometimes his response to certain situations come across as all the more jarring. For instance, in the beginning of his campaign, when Vanitas threatens that Terra will disappear and come back as a completely different person, Ventus simply responds like this.
Look, whoever you are, you don't know the first thing about Terra. Me and him will always be a team. You trying to pick a fight or what?
This is a complete stranger that just walked into his room and is giving him some cryptic messaging. If I were Ventus, I'd be kind of freaked out, but it feels like Ventus is super confident and doesn't question at all how Vanitas got into his bedroom. And then he does things like call Aqua awful. which just really displays the close friendship they have, or scream out into the wilderness for Terra for no reason. These might be small, but they just accentuate his annoying nature. And as for him looking like Roxas, I understand that Nomura did this for lore purposes, and it sort of makes sense, but what really bothers me is this weird design they were going for with his clothes. It sort of looks like a half-light, half-dark design, almost like the yin-yang. The reason this doesn't fit is because Ventus has no darkness in him, so this wouldn't be at a balance. Maybe a better design would be for Ven's shirt to look like the yin side, because it would represent the light and feminine side that fits with him so well. And, well, as for Jesse McCartney's voice work, the high-pitched voice more or less works because Ventus isn't Roxas. Still, it pisses me off that they had to change the voice lines in 2.5. Why did they need to do that? As mentioned before, Ventus just doesn't have the same angst that Roxas has. So the fact that they changed the battlegrounds of Roxas to that of Ventus kind of feels out of character. But going back to Ventus, he's basically one-dimensional and defined by a single character trait. It's debated whether he's more like Kairi or Sora. I guess Kairi would make the most sense since they're both so stale and boring. But some of you might be saying, well, at least he doesn't have the stupidity of Terra, and hear me out. I actually don't think that Terra is that bad of a character. You see, I can kind of see what they were trying to do with him. A lot of people get angry at him for trusting all the villains, and for going along with the Xehanort despite the fact that it should be obvious he's evil. Well, here's the thing. It's implied that Ericus is a very protective mentor. Because he was so afraid of the darkness in the outer world, he sheltered Terra and Aqua. So, because Terra never quite experienced the external worlds for himself, he'd have no way of being able to distinguish between who was a good guy and who was a bad guy. As for why he couldn't see through Master Xehanort, well, Xehanort at the time was one of the more respected Keyblade Masters. He himself was invited to attend the Mark of Mastery exam by Ericus. To Terra, Xehanort is his master's friend. I think the real question we should be asking is why Terra never learns after each encounter he has with a Disney villain. You'd expect right after his scuffle with Maleficent and the Queen, he might have some trust issues with some of the other individuals he runs into in the journey, but he just keeps listening to them over and over again. Granted, he's able to catch himself each time, but dude, I'd expect you to pay more attention to what's going on around you. As a side note, for all the people that like to insult Terra's basic intelligence, Ventus allows the Queen to take hold of the apple, Aqua trusts Skontu with the orders of exterminating Stitch. This isn't really something that's wholly exclusive to Terra. But I really think the egregious part of the critique behind Terra's character is that the game itself doesn't seem to understand his inner conflict. Ericus states that Terra is blinded by his longing for power. Even in his Xehanort reports, he states he found Terra to be a suitable vessel because of his hunger for power. But throughout the game, Terra isn't obsessed with power at all. He's obsessed with the fact that he's let his master down. If anything, it kind of shows how strict Ericus's control was over Terra and Aqua. In a way, I can relate to this having been raised in one of those really strict Christian religions. I found myself constantly questioning the teachings that my parents liked to fill in my head. This is what I think they were trying to do with Terra. However, it's not done particularly very well because we don't quite get to see Ericus and Terra's relationship. We're told in the beginning that Ericus thinks of him as a son, but we don't get to see this fully explored except through little flashbacks, and these barely tell us anything. So when Terra does turn on his master, it kind of doesn't have the same weight and tension it should have had because we never see them together except in the beginning and end. But then we get to Aqua, and of the two, she's in this weird middle position for me. She does show herself to be resourceful and wise with the choices that she makes, so you won't see her making too many mistakes. At least up until the final episode where she's the initiator for everything that goes wrong in future installments. She does seem to care a lot for Terra and is protective of Ventus, which makes her almost like a big sister archetype. However, where she really falls flat is that her arc isn't very well defined. I understand that it's supposed to be about how she handles the burden of being a Keyblade Master and learns to think beyond the binary teachings of Master Ericus. However, the game doesn't do a good job of showing how she's changing. I guess in Deep Space she sort of shows some development by disobeying orders to save Stitch, but she appears to have the same way of thinking in her interactions within the other worlds. she keeps thinking that darkness is plain evil.
Why not flit over here and demonstrate some real courage for the winning team?
The darkness doesn't interest me. What else is darkness but hate and rage? Xehanort is feeding the dark fires within you, making you fight.
Her lack of charisma doesn't help. The only times where she shows any character at all is when Zack asks her out for a date and when she accidentally falls in the middle of Cinderella trying on her missing slipper. I think these parts stand out because it puts Aqua in a situation where she has to think on her feet, and because she's not really good at that, it makes her come across as adorable and awkwardly funny in these moments. Sadly, these were few and far between. Willa Holland's performance also doesn't sell her as a character. Just take the scene where she's strangled by Terranort. Holland simply gasps here and there, while in the Japanese version, it's pretty obvious she's being choked. Although I'll say her design is her most redeeming factor, and I know what you all are thinking, but it's not what you think. She doesn't look too traditional in regards to how most female characters look. This is especially shown with subtle details like how her hair is done in a bob, which makes her appear more warrior-like, but then she doesn't look like Abby from The Last of Us Part 2. There are still some feminine features to her like the white cufflets around her wrists and the two swaying skirt strands on her side. Although, if there are any Abby moments I can think of, it really is something that she can effortlessly smash brick floors with her feet in Enchanted Dominion. But all in all, I like what they were trying to do with these characters. In a way, it's not too different from that of the Destiny Island trio in the sense that these three have no knowledge of the outside world. They were kept safe within the hospitality of Master Ericus, who indoctrinated all of them to be biased to the light. There can be a lot of interesting character analysis in regards to questions like, if Ericus hadn't taught his pupils to be so close-minded to the darkness, could Terra have been saved? Or had Aqua questioned some of the Masters' teachings, could she have related to Terra more? Sadly, none of this was presented well, so all it leaves behind is a dull dumpster fire. And their interactions within the Disney worlds aren't any better. Terra, Ventus, and Aqua's individual journeys are split up into different subsections that make up one story. Similar to Cage 2, most of these are rehashes of the movies. Sometimes it feels like the game rips scenes straight from the film and photoshops Aqua in the background. As was the complaint with Kingdom Hearts 2, the Disney stories are separate from the main plot itself. In Kingdom Hearts 1, there was some intertwining of the Disney worlds with the main story, as seen with how King Triton somehow knows about the Keyblade, and you see a little bit of this when the Fairy Godmother tries to tell Aqua that light and darkness had to be at a balance just before she is about to slay Lady Tremaine. But here's the problem with this. Whereas with Kingdom Hearts 1, the scene showed the perception of the Keyblade's power across the world, the Fairy Godmother lecturing Aqua doesn't really go anywhere, because Aqua continues to be biased towards the light throughout the game. She might seem like she learned something through this interaction, but she clearly just forgets about it, as seen with the way she treats Terra at Radiant Garden. If we were shown her reflecting on the Godmother's words, then maybe this scene would have more meaning. Kind of like what Terra does with Ericus's teachings in the Sleeping Beauty scene. But for Aqua, we don't get to see any of that. And I hate to say this is the same issue with the villains. The Xehanort reports make the main antagonist sound sympathetic. He writes about how he's growing old, and he fears about not living long enough to fulfill his goals, which is to start another Keyblade war out of sheer curiosity. The problem with this is that if you choose to ignore the reports, you'd just think that Xehanort is just another conniving evil villain without remorse. He freezes Ventus and torments him by splitting his darkness away from him. He takes over Terra's body and chokes Aqua. Maybe you could say he's an unreliable narrator into reports, but the Xehanort we read about sounds more complex than the mustache-twirling baddie we see in the game. Leonor Nimoy's excellent voice work is probably his only saving grace. Vanitas basically suffers from the same thing. Now, to be honest, I haven't read the BBS novel, but from the little sections I've looked at, Xehanort tortures him during his training, which makes Vanitas scarred for life. We see none of said attention in the game. Vanitas spends most of his time mocking Aqua and Ventus and then fucking off. He's basically the darkness manifest of Ventus, and he needs to merge with him to form the Keyblade. However, despite knowing all of this, There's one point in the game where he tries to kill him. This doesn't make any sense because Vanitas needs Ventus to craft Kingdom Hearts' version of a nuclear weapon. At the same time, it could show the strained relationship he had with Xehanort. But again, sadly you have to read the novel to find that out, for it's not even hinted at in the game. Also, while for the majority of the game he wears a mask, his face is revealed to look more like Sora. The lore explanation behind this is kinda finicky. I guess because Sora healed the other half of Ven's heart, Vanitas just adopted that look. But, I mean, could they really not come up with an original design? Ventus looking like Roxas made sense, but Vanitas looking like Sora just makes me frustrated how everything in the Kingdom Hearts universe needs to somehow be centered on him. And finally we have Ericus, who isn't really considered a villain, but he can be seen as one. If you think about it, he's the one who's responsible for indoctrinating the Wayfinder trio. He kept the truth from Ventus, which prevented him from getting a fuller understanding of himself, and he taught Terra and Aqua a very binary perspective of light and darkness, which did more harm to both of them. All I can say is that I wish we saw more of him. He's a character that seems very gray. Clearly he cares about the Wayfinder trio and wants the best for them, but at the same time he's very much blinded by his own narrow philosophies. The scenes that actually feature him are very sparse. A lot of what we know about him is from exposition Xehanort provides to Terra and Ventus. Maybe we can see the effects of his teachings with the ways Terra and Aqua respond to situations. However, because his presence is more or less lacking, he doesn't feel as fleshed out as he could have been. So, at the end of the day, Birth by Sleep fails as both a prequel and a story. It's not all bad though. There are some interesting thematic elements about how the enculturation of one's home can do more harm than good, as seen with how Ericus sheltering Terra, Ventus, and Aqua made them less adept in facing the trials Xehanort put them through. Unfortunately, these good things are weighed down by the fact that the setting and atmosphere aren't clearly defined, and the characters are either not very well written or badly acted. In a way, Birth by Sleep took the bold step of reinventing a lot of concepts and creating a background for the Keyblade wielders. Sadly, it really left more to be desired, and this could also be applied to Birth by Sleep's gameplay. Now, for the astute viewer, you've probably noticed how little I've said about this department. Sadly, it doesn't look too good in this area either, mostly because of the combat system. They already had something that worked from Kingdom Hearts 2. All they had to do was build off of what was already established. Starting from scratch caused the Osaka team to make something even worse. I get that they were trying to fix Kingdom Hearts 2 being too easy, but at least Kingdom Hearts 2's system was functional. So, Birth by Sleep replaced the traditional Final Fantasy scroll-down menu with a list of commands. All of your spells and combo modifiers are now placed within these slots. The challenge behind this aspect emerges when all of these commands have their own cooldown, which prevents it from being used for a period of time, kind of like the MP cooldown of Kingdom Hearts 2. So, considering that some commands like Cure require a longer time to recharge before it becomes usable, you need to utilize them wisely. You'd think that this would incorporate a bit of strategy into the battles, but there's one aspect that throws it entirely off course, and that's the enemy AI. Generally speaking, these unversed literally don't care about how they're being attacked. Either they don't stagger, or they will hit you out of a combo. I could go down each of the unversed types to demonstrate the problems they introduce. First, there are the bruisers. Unlike the large bodies, the bruisers don't have a weak spot. You can attack them from both the front and the back. The problem with this is that it makes you much more open to their attacks. You might be in the middle of a combo when one of these guys might decide to suddenly run towards you and knock you over. Somebody with a counter-argument might say that these are one of the bigger enemies, so of course they don't stagger as easily. In fact, the large bodies have the exact same problem. But because they have a weak point in their back, their attacks are much easier to navigate around. As you can see, the main way that I dealt with the bruisers was to keep as much distance as I could from them, mainly focusing on ranged attacks to deal damage. The hair raisers have a slightly different problem. While their stagger is a bit more consistent, they will hit you out of a combo quite often. Just getting near one to land a single strike can make them knock you into the air. Their worst move is when they start cartwheeling towards you, which can stunlock you if you get caught in it. The best way to avoid this is to dodge out of the way. I'm sure you can start to see a pattern here. Some of the Unversed have a little gimmick that gives an extra headache to the battles. This is mostly the case with their ranged attackers. The mandrakes hide underground and take pot shots at you. The worst part about this is that they'll constantly fire at you while you might be fighting another foe. The only way to deal with this is to dodge roll in their direction to uproot them out of the ground. If there are several of them in the same vicinity, this could lead to an untimely death because while you're trying to resurface one, others could open fire on you. But the jelly shades are much worse than the mandrakes without question. It's incredibly difficult to interact with them directly because they don't give a proper sign as to when they might charge you. While this only does minimal damage, they get harder to deal with when they show up in groups as they can overwhelm you with this move and bring you down to 0 HP instantly. The best way to do combat with them is to magnet without mercy. Then proceed with constant dodge rolling before releasing another magnet. This should be easy for Aqua and Ven with their invincible dodge roll frames, but good luck with Terra. But besides being unversed, what do the battle strategies to these enemies all have in common? They all involve relying on those dodge roll iframes while unleashing ranged attacks. Now you might be asking, well, aren't there a lot of options in Birth by Sleep? After all, there are D-links, shot locks, and form changes. Well, if you've been paying attention, only a handful of these actually work consistently. Thunder Surge is the best command in the game that guarantees staggering an enemy. Having several magnets and thunders equipped and using them interchangeably works wonders. Finally, if you spam Ignite on an Unversed, they practically melt. The problem is it makes a lot of the battles cheap. It also demonstrates how a majority of the other commands either aren't functional or worsen over time. Another contentious subject with Birth by Sleep's battle system are the invincibility frames. Some of the really OP commands like Faraga Burst don't have iframes, so even though they deal a lot of damage, they can also easily get you killed since you're vulnerable while standing still. Again, Thunder Surge is the only command that lets you have iframes while doing a decent amount of damage. Sure, maybe somebody is going to point out that Final Form Faraga in KH2 was a problem, but at least in KH2, the enemy behavior was consistent, whereas in Birth by Sleep, it's kind of random over whether they break out of a combo or stagger. And then there are D-Links. Now I'm kind of mixed when it comes to these. D-Links are basically what take the place of summons because the PSP hardware apparently couldn't handle them. Basically they change all of your commands, and once you build up enough meter, you get to use a special limit. Now, the real downside with these is how they change up your commands. If the D-Link doesn't have a cure, then it becomes troublesome to use. When enemies refuse to stagger or hit you out of combos, then some of the commands in your original deck are more preferred compared to the prearranged deck that the D-Link has. You may have intentionally organized your commands in a way to handle different types of situations. However, because the D-Link changes your deck to a preset one, it actually makes using it feel more restrictive. Now, some of them have really good finishers to make up for the crappy command selection, but it takes time to get to that threshold. This is kind of why I only found myself using a handful of D-Links. Most of the commands they gave you didn't do me any favors in the battles. The Cinderella and Stitch D-Links were exceptions because they both contained surge commands, and their respective limits were good for dealing with crowd control. I guess an easy way to upgrade them as Ventus is to run over enemies with a Yarn Ball in Castle of Dreams. So maybe at least while playing as him, D-Links are allowed to reach their fullest potential. The style changes have their own issues. Some of them really augment the combat style of the Wayfinder trio. Spellweaver is really good because it has a decent reach that can hit multiple enemies at once, and its finisher can turn the tables in boss battles. Rockbreaker also gives a great sense of power with every strike. The ones that are problematic are the style changes that get in the way of fighting. Skyclimber, for instance, has a little extra animation that has Ventus or Aqua planting their feet on the ground before doing a command. This wastes a lot of time and often got me hit. Also, style changes like Skyclimber took away the ability to dodge roll, which also makes you more vulnerable. An easy fix for this problem would have been to allow for an option where you can turn off the form changes, but alas, such is not the universe we live in. Oh, and I almost forgot about the melding system. Funny how something that's supposed to be a major component in the game is one that's so forgettable. On the surface, this sounds like a fun method that involves combining different commands to get a stronger one. However, the fundamental flaw here is that there's no way to figure out what you're going to get, so you might combine two commands and end up getting something that isn't up to par. It also forces me to consult a walkthrough to figure out what I'm going to get out of each meld. There are some very powerful commands that can be gotten from the melding process. However, if half the time you don't know what you're getting, it becomes a guessing game. Therefore, I wouldn't blame you if you didn't use it that much. It's not quite a necessity to get through the game if you can just ignite and thunder everything. Maybe you'll need it to get Thunder Surge, but for the most part you could just choose not to dabble with it at all and still get by in the game. And for what it's worth, it's a very complex system. It's very interesting how different gems and crystals attach different abilities to a command. Sadly, the execution wasn't very good. When you're trying to get that once more or second chance, every ingredient has to be exact. Otherwise, you get something completely different. Finally, we have the shot locks, and this is probably the most useless feature in the game. Basically, if you find yourself in a sticky situation, you can hold down the R1 button to target several enemies. This causes you to release several blasts all at once. You can spam it to deal extra damage. However, because there are commands like Thunder Surge and Ignite, it doesn't feel necessary to get through the game. The only time where I actually needed to use it was for the iframes. It's a bit of a shame considering there were multiple shot locks to be found in your playthrough, some of them having devastating effects. However, besides being useless, the implementation was relatively cheap, since most shot locks quickly deplete a boss's health by the mashing of the X button. Maybe for a number of them, they had you time the X button press, but there's no real skill involved. But besides the gameplay mechanics, Birth by Sleep's bosses are worth mentioning because of how infamous they are. You have the typical unversed foes, and these were pretty much a hit or miss. Trinity armor was rather difficult because the boss actually becomes harder when you try to split it into multiple pieces. It performs a spin attack that has no tell whatsoever, so make sure you're in a corner dodge rolling like crazy because it's an instant death if you get touched by it. You have the Metamorphosis that Ventus fights, and once more it's a boss that refuses to stagger. However, this one is a little easier if you have Ignite because, as I indicated before, you could just stack a bunch of these to drain his health away. A similar dominant strat applies to Experiment 221. All you have to do is get him on the ground and start spamming Stopga while performing melee combos in between. This, again, accentuates the whole issue with this game's tendency to rely on dominant strats to play in order to survive some of these battles. Now you might be thinking, you don't have to play the game that way, just don't use Thunder Surge if it makes the experience boring. Let me tell you, if it's in the game, it's in the game. BBS's enemy behavior creates so much frustration, especially on the harder difficulties, that if there's a way around it, I'll take it. Honestly, it makes me wonder if Osaka Team actually tested the game on critical mode. But the worst offenders in terms of bosses are the humanoid battles. Vanitas basically teleports all over the place, even in his initial boss fights where he's vulnerable to status ailments and magnets. It's arbitrary whether he's affected by it or not. Also, he has this little mini-game in his final boss that I always found to be frustrating, as there's no explanation for what to do in this part. While I never died in this part in all my playthroughs, it was always an extra thing to be stressed about. Tyrannort won't stop dashing every time you try to hit him. Because he's basically Xehanort possessing Terra's body, he has all the abilities that Terra has, so if you get trapped in an Arsolum, that pretty much means your entire HP depletes if you don't have second chance. Granted, they were able to demonstrate the insanity and violent nature of Tyrannort through his relentless fighting style, and this especially shines when you fight him as Aqua in the final episode, because it really cements that the friend she once knew is no longer there. That being said, it's still made for a frustrating fight. The super bosses aren't any better. Vanitas Remnant has all the bad things about regular Vanitas, except it's worse because he has really high defense that makes you only do chip damage. Also, he has a special attack where he sends out multiple clones of himself, and getting hit by one blinds you. Seeker Mines aren't the most effective way at killing him, but even then you have to watch his health gradually whittle away while you cartwheel spam. And then we have the elephant in the room. young Xehanort, otherwise known as the Mysterious Figure. Basically, this boss takes everything wrong with Birth by Sleep's combat system and rolls it all into one. Where to begin? Well, he doesn't have a lot of clear openings because when you do try to attack him, he'll either suddenly strike or perform a renewal block. A lot of his moves are punishing if you mess up, so the best you can hope for is to just keep dodge rolling. Damn, I feel like Dory. Except instead of saying just keep swimming, I'm saying just keep dodge rolling. It gets worse in the second phase of the battle where he becomes invisible and shoots fireballs that makes the entire screen turn white. Make sure to look for the times where he activates his red cross, because he'll slow himself down just enough for you to land a thunder surge on him. Other than that, everything is based off of luck. And in case you're wondering, yes, I've beaten this guy before, and here's proof. But for all the criticism I've given Birth by Sleep's combat, it mostly manages to do everything else well. Emphasis on the word mostly. While the combat sadly is the core gameplay that makes up a good chunk of BBS, it nails the general level design. While KH2 mostly had hallway sims, BBS brings back the sense of exploration and platforming of the original. Now, it's unfortunate to say that it really doesn't do much to improve over what was in the original Kingdom Hearts, but it still has its own quirks. On the surface, Disney Town might feel like nothing except a minigame world. However, going down a sewer takes you to a pinball machine that actually has you bumping Terra, Aqua, and Ventus as if they were actual pinballs. What's more is that hitting all the green pegs provides them with the break time command. In Castle of Dreams, different material like forks or slices of cheese serve as launchers or platforms for Ventus to jump on. While it's nowhere near as complex as something like Crash Bandicoot, it still shows how Osaka implemented a lot of creativity into levels. If they had just reused a combat from KH2, BBS would have been perfect. For the other elements of the game, the Mirage Arena improves over the cup tournaments in previous installments. Interestingly, this is the only area where I felt like the battle system was at its best. There was a sense of satisfaction as I plowed through enemies effortlessly. It's hard to say why it felt so good here and not for the rest of the game. Maybe it was because the open area gave more freedom of movement. Speaking of which, Osaka made a lot of creative arena stages. Instead of just fighting in the same stadium over and over, some of the battles have you constantly changing environments. In the Monster of the Deep fight, you go back and forth between fighting Monstro and going inside his stomach to confront the Unversed. Another feature that put the Mirage Arena above the Olympus Coliseum is the currency system. For every challenge you complete, medals can be spent for different abilities. However, it's not really said what these do. I understand that the victory pose gives experience, but I couldn't figure out what the fireworks did. The command board, on the other hand, is a different story. To start with the good, the command board was very useful in getting certain attributes like Magnet into early game. However, where it falls short is the overall tedium of getting through it. The main goal to beating this is to get a certain number of GP points before the other players do. Because you have to take turns and watch the other player roll the die and to take out their Keyblade glider and such, it felt very plodding to sit through. Again, you don't have to touch this at all. Getting Magnet was enough for me. As for the Disney Town minigames like Fruit Ball, Rumble Racing, and Ice Cream Beat, I found them leaving me with not a whole lot to say about them. I guess with Ice Cream Beat, there's some fan service to be found with the fact that you can play the Gummy Ship and Destiny Island themes, although, for the most part, these feel like little extras that don't particularly add much to the game. But having too many cooks in the kitchen isn't Birth by Sleep's problem. The main issue with this prequel is that it took a scorched earth approach instead of building off the groundwork of its predecessor. It reworked a lot of the lore like the way Keyblades worked. Maybe KH2 started this mess, but BBS made it more confusing. In terms of the gameplay, it reinvented the wheel by introducing the command menu when it could have easily improved over what KH2 did. While it had some good ideas, the enemy AI ruined a lot of the potential it could have had. The three main protagonists don't feel fully fleshed out and come across as less appealing versions of Sora, Riku, and Kairi. Master Xehanort isn't consistent with how he depicts himself in the reports and how he acts in the game. And for the love of fucking God, can you please come up with original character designs? But you know what? There's a part of me, if I were to be honest, that finds Birth by Sleep to be a guilty pleasure. Even though the tragedy of the Wayfinder trio isn't fully developed, it still has a bit of catharsis to it. I can't quite explain it. There's a part of me that wants to save them as much as I want to implore them over their unintellectual decisions. As binary and boring as Aqua came across, there's a tiny part of me that kind of feels sorry for everything she goes through. There was a point in my life where I was just like her, having grown up in a monotheistic Christian family and just blindly following everything without second thought. As annoying and stubborn as Ventus came across, the scene where he accuses Master Ericus of keeping him inside a prison and lying to him all this time reminds me of my current life circumstances, and as for Terra, well, I never really had a problem with Terra being dumb. As I reiterated before, I always just thought he was kind of misunderstood. And honestly, even with the gameplay, as frustrating as fighting some of these bosses and enemies were, there was satisfaction just getting through them. Even if they're not well designed, it's still something that gets me excited when I finally laid a last word on Vanitas and breathe a sigh of relief that Ventus's campaign is over, or release that last thunder surge on Mysterious Figure. The process may not be fun, but the end is satisfying. It's like, I hate this game, but when I look back, I think, maybe there were little things that could have been made into something greater. Birth by Sleep is a bold prequel that tried to reinvent the wheel for Kingdom Hearts. Perhaps that's something to be appreciated, even if it failed miserably. Well, that's all I have for you. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.